The day Susanna Carter arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, she stepped off the stage with $17, a battered carpetbag, and a letter of employment that 3 men along the way had tried to take from her, because a woman traveling alone in the summer of 1878 was considered either reckless or desperate, and Susanna Carter was decidedly both. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who had been punched too many times and had simply decided to stop flinching. It was loud and sun-beaten and smelled of cattle and leather, and something else that Susanna could not quite name, until she realized it was the particular brand of loneliness that settles into a place when too many people have passed through it without ever truly stopping. Wooden storefronts lined the main street in uneven rows, their painted signs fading in the Kansas heat. A blacksmith hammered somewhere to the east. A dog slept in the center of the road and declined to move for anyone. Susanna adjusted the bag on her shoulder and unfolded the letter again, though she had memorized it weeks ago. It read, in a hand that she had since decided belonged to a man who rarely wrote anything down, "Position of cook and housekeeper, Haskins Ranch, 4 miles northeast of Caldwell. Room and board provided. Wage to be discussed upon arrival. Inquire at the general store for directions." It was signed Peter Haskins, and it contained no other pleasantries, no welcome, no indication that the man who wrote it had ever in his life considered whether the person reading it might want one. She found the general store without difficulty, because it was the building with the most people standing outside of it arguing about something that appeared to involve a mule. A woman behind the counter inside, somewhere between 50 and ancient, looked Susanna over from boots to hat brim in the way that women in small towns look at newcomers, which is to say entirely and without apology. "I'm looking for directions to the Haskins Ranch," Susanna said. "I've been hired on as housekeeper and cook." The woman's expression shifted into something that was not quite sympathy, but was close enough to it that Susanna felt a small warning ignite somewhere behind her sternum. "Peter Haskins hired a woman," the storekeeper said. Her name, Susanna would later learn, was Mrs. Aldred, and she had opinions about everything and kept none of them to herself. "He did," Susanna said, "or someone did. The letter came under his name." Mrs. Aldred leaned on the counter. "That'll have been his foreman, Lou Garrett, doing the writing for him. Peter Haskins doesn't correspond much these days." She paused. "Doesn't do much of anything much these days, if I'm being honest, and I generally am. You know what happened to his wife?" Susanna did not, and she said so. "Clara Haskins passed 2 winters back. Fever took her in 3 days. Left him with a ranch to run, 600 head of cattle, and a 7-year-old boy who barely speaks above a whisper." Mrs. Aldred straightened up and shook her head. "Man's been running that place on stubbornness and black coffee ever since. Went through 2 cooks in 6 months. First one quit because he wouldn't eat what she put in front of him. Second one quit because he wouldn't speak to her for a full week straight." Susanna absorbed this information. She had come from Missouri, from a family that had more opinions than money, and she had worked as a kitchen hand in St. Joseph for 2 years before the restaurant closed, and her cousin in Caldwell had sent word about the advertisement. She was 26 years old and possessed of a particular stubbornness of her own that she had always considered a liability and was beginning to suspect might be an asset. "I'll take the directions," she said. Mrs. Aldred gave them to her, along with a wedge of cheese and an apple that she pressed into Susanna's hands without being asked. "You'll need something in your stomach before you meet him," the older woman said. "He's not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He's just a man who's forgotten how to be around people. There's a difference." The wagon that took her to the ranch belonged to a boy named Tommy who worked for Lou Garrett, and who talked the entire 4 miles about cattle prices and the likelihood of rain, and a horse he had once seen that could count to 5. Susanna listened and ate the apple, and watched the Kansas grassland open around them in great golden waves. The sky above it, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have never needed anyone's approval to be so. The ranch house came into view as the road curved over a low rise. It was larger than she had expected, solidly built from timber and limestone, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and a kitchen garden to the side that had gone mostly to weeds. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals where horses moved in the afternoon light. It was a working ranch, clearly, and a prosperous one, or it had been. The main house carried the particular look of a place where no one had been paying attention to the details for a long time. Lou Garrett met her at the wagon. He was a lean, weathered man in his early 40s with a handlebar mustache and the permanently squinting expression of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. He shook her hand with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been well raised and thanked Tommy for the ride. "Miss Carter," he said, "good journey." "Long," she said, "but complete." He almost smiled. "I'll show you the kitchen first, that's what matters most. Then I'll introduce you to young Ben, and when Mr. Haskins comes in from the range, I'll introduce you to him. Fair warning about that last part." "Mrs. Aldred already gave me a fair warning," Susanna said. This time Lou Garrett did smile, briefly and at the ground. "Good woman. Probably saved you some shock." He picked up her carpetbag before she could reach for it, and they walked toward the house. The kitchen was large and had good bones, which is a thing that people say about kitchens, and about people when they mean that the essential structure is sound, but the surface needs considerable work. The iron stove was excellent, a big majestic range that had probably cost more than the furniture in the rest of the house. The larder was stocked reasonably well. The surfaces were clean but joyless, the kind of clean that happens when someone scrubs for function and never for comfort. There were no herbs hanging, no jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, nothing that suggested the room had ever been used by someone who took pleasure in food. "Your room is through that door," Lou said, nodding toward the far end of the kitchen. "It's small, but it's got a window. Clara Haskins used it as a sewing room back when. I hope that doesn't bother you." "It doesn't bother me," Susanna said. She walked to the window. From it she could see the kitchen garden and beyond it a line of cottonwood trees along what must have been a creek. The late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the grass, turning it the color of old honey. "Supper," Lou said. "If you're up to it. There's a haunch of venison in the larder, dried beans, some cornmeal." "I'm up to it," she said. She found the boy Benjamin Haskins sitting at the kitchen table 20 minutes later, watching her work with an expression of careful, serious attention. He was small for 7, dark-haired like what she guessed his father probably was, with gray eyes that held an unnerving stillness. He didn't say hello. He didn't say anything. He just watched her as she moved between stove and larder, assembling the meal. "You ever helped in a kitchen before?" She asked him not because she needed help, but because she recognized what silence could become if you let it sit too long in a child. He shook his head. "Would you like to learn?" He considered this with the gravity of a judge. Then he nodded once. "Good," she said. She put a bowl in front of him and a handful of dried beans beside it. "You sort those. Take out any that are cracked or shriveled. I'll teach you the rest as we go." He sorted beans with complete concentration for the next 10 minutes while she worked around him, and she had the distinct impression that this was the most he had engaged with anything in a while. He reminded her of a plant that has been kept in too much shade and has nearly forgotten that it ever wanted sunlight. She heard boots on the porch before the door opened. Heavy, deliberate boots that struck the boards with the particular confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on and knew it. The kitchen door swung inward, and Peter Haskins filled the frame. He was taller than she had pictured, which was saying something because she had pictured him fairly tall based on the way Mrs. Aldred had described him. He was in his early 30s, she guessed, though the set of his jaw and the lines around his eyes made him look like a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that his body had simply rearranged itself around the weight. Dark hair, dark brows, jaw shadowed with several days of growth. He wore the clothes of a working rancher, worn at the knees and elbows, and he carried his hat in one hand and was using the other to pull off his leather gloves. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes moved from her to the stove to Ben and back to her, and the look on his face was not unfriendly exactly, but it was absolutely and entirely closed, the way a house looks when every shutter has been pulled and every door has been latched. "You're the new cook," he said. It was not a question. "Susanna Carter," she said. She did not extend her hand because he was still holding his hat and his gloves, and also because she sensed that he was not, at this particular moment, a man who was going to shake anyone's hand. He looked at Ben again. "You eaten yet?" Ben shook his head and pointed at the stove. Peter Haskins looked at the stove. Something moved briefly across his face, an expression too fast to name, and then it was gone. He set his hat on the hook by the door and walked to the basin to wash his hands. "Supper in 15 minutes, Susanna said. "If that suits." He dried his hands on a length of cloth and said nothing to indicate whether it suited or not, and walked out of the kitchen toward what she presumed was the rest of the house. Susanna looked at Ben, who was watching the door his father had gone through with an expression that was almost too old for his face. She turned back to the stove and stirred the pot. "Does he always walk in like that?" she asked, mostly to herself. Ben looked at her. "Like what?" He said, and it was the first thing he had said to her, soft and a little rusty, like a door that had not been opened in some time. "Like he's not quite sure he wants to be where he is," she said. Ben thought about it. "Yes," he said, "since Mama died." She nodded and said nothing else, and the beans finished cooking, and she made corn bread in the cast iron pan, and sliced the venison, and set everything on the table with a steadiness that she was proud of, because her heart had done something complicated when the boy said those words. Peter Haskins came back to the table. Lou Garrett appeared from somewhere and sat down across from Ben. They ate in a silence that was clearly habitual, the silence of men who have been eating together long enough that they have stopped trying to fill the space between them with words. The venison was good, she knew it was good, and the corn bread was excellent, and the beans were properly seasoned in a way that the previous two cooks, she was beginning to suspect, had not bothered with. Peter Haskins ate without comment. He did not look at her. He refilled his coffee himself, and then he put his fork down and looked at the empty pot of beans and then at her for the first time since sitting down, and he said, in a voice that was rough-edged and completely matter-of-fact, "Could you pass the bread?" She was about to hand him the plate when something made her pause. Not a dramatic pause, not a pointed one. Just a half-second in which she registered what had not been said, and then she passed him the bread without comment. It was only later, washing the dishes by lamplight while Ben slept, and Lou had gone to the bunkhouse, and Peter Haskins had disappeared somewhere into the house, that she understood what she had been waiting for without knowing it. She stood at the basin and listened to the night sounds of the Kansas plain, the crickets, and the distant low of cattle and the wind in the cottonwoods. And she thought about a man who had been ordering and receiving and commanding for so long that the word please had simply dropped out of his vocabulary somewhere along the way, worn smooth, and then gone, like a stone that has been in a riverbed too long. She was up before sunrise the next morning, which was her habit. She had the stove fired and coffee on and biscuits in the oven by the time the sky went from black to the deep bruised purple of very early morning. She was cutting salt pork for the skillet when she heard movement in the house, and a few minutes later Peter Haskins appeared in the kitchen doorway in the gray pre-dawn. He stopped when he smelled the coffee, and she saw something happen in his face, a softening so brief she almost missed it. He crossed to the stove and poured himself a cup, and she moved to give him space, and they were quiet for a moment in the kitchen with the fire going and the smell of biscuits and coffee and salt pork building around them. He poured a second cup and set it on the counter near where she was working, for her. She looked at it, then at him, but he had already turned back toward the window, looking out at the first thin line of light on the horizon. "You're up early," he said. It was neither a complaint nor an approval, it was just an observation. "I've always been an early riser," she said. He drank his coffee. She cooked. The biscuits came out golden, the salt pork crisped properly, and she scrambled eggs from the henhouse with a generous hand. She set a plate at his usual place at the table and then went to the larder for more salt, and when she came back, he was still standing at the window with his coffee. "It's on the table," she said. He turned and looked at the plate, and then he did something she had not seen him do yet. He pulled out the chair and sat down, not because the movement of sitting was unusual, but because the ease of it was, the way a man sits when someone has put food in front of him, and he has allowed himself, just for a moment, to let someone else do the taking care of things. He ate. She busied herself at the stove. Ben came shuffling in, his hair sticking up on one side, still mostly asleep, and climbed onto his chair and put his chin on the table and looked at the food with the detached interest of a child who has not yet fully committed to being awake. "Sit up," Peter said, without looking at his son, and Ben sat up. Susanna put a smaller plate in front of Ben and watched him come alive at the smell of the biscuits the same way a flower turns toward light, and she thought that this kitchen, this morning, this house, needed some tending in ways that had nothing to do with cooking. She was refilling Peter Haskins' coffee when it happened. He reached for the plate of biscuits that she had set in the center of the table, and it was slightly out of his reach, and rather than lean further, he looked up at her and said, in a voice that was careful and a little surprised at itself, "Would you pass those, please?" The word landed in the kitchen like a pebble dropped into still water, creating rings that spread out in all directions. She did not react visibly. She passed the biscuits. She went back to the stove. But she was aware, in some specific and important way, of what had just happened. And she was aware, though she could not have said precisely how she knew this, that he was aware of it too. He sat very still for just a moment after she passed the plate, and then he took a biscuit and ate it, and she heard Ben say, quietly, to no one in particular, "Papa said please." Peter Haskins did not respond to his son's observation. He drank his coffee and looked at the window. But the line of his shoulders had changed by some almost imperceptible degree, as though a small knot somewhere in the architecture of him had come loose, and Susanna Carter, at the stove with her back turned, felt the change as clearly as she felt the heat from the fire. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. The days that followed built themselves one on top of another, with the slow, careful logic of a stone wall being laid by someone who understands that each piece depends on all the others. Susanna learned the rhythms of the Haskins ranch the way she had learned every difficult thing in her life, by paying attention and not hurrying her conclusions. She learned that Peter was up before anyone else on the days when something was weighing on him, which was most days, and that he drank his first cup of coffee standing at the east-facing window in the kitchen regardless of the weather, watching the light come up over the grass. She learned that he took his meals seriously, in the sense that he was a man who ate when he was hungry and stopped when he was full, and had no interest in the social aspects of meals that other people seemed to find important. She learned that he was hard on his horses in the sense that he expected a great deal from them, but that he was also meticulous about their care in a way that told her something important about the kind of man he was when no one was explaining himself to anyone. She learned that he was good with Ben in the wordless, practical way of men, who have not been given good models of tenderness, but who have decided to be present anyway, and that he would sometimes stand in the doorway of Ben's room at night for a long moment before he went to his own bed, just looking at the sleeping boy in the way a person looks at something they are terrified of losing. Lou Garrett became her clearest source of information, not because he gossiped, but because he was a man who had known Peter Haskins for 12 years, and who understood that certain things needed to be communicated to the person taking care of the household. Clara was the one who talked, Lou told her one afternoon when she had brought coffee out to the yard where he was working on a harness. She had enough words for both of them, and she used them. When she was gone, the house just went quiet, and Peter's not the kind of man who knows how to start a conversation that isn't about cattle or weather. "He's starting to talk more," Susanna said. She was not sure why she said it. It felt important to note. Lou looked at her sideways. "Is he?" "A little," she said. Yesterday he told me the coffee was good. Lou blinked. Peter Haskins told you the coffee was good. He did. Lou was quiet for a moment, working the leather through his hands. That man hasn't volunteered a comment about food or drink since Clara died, he said. He just ate and drank whatever was put in front of him like fuel, never said a word about it. Susanna thought about the biscuits on that first morning, the pleas that had come out of him like something he had been carrying in his pocket for a long time without knowing it was there. She drank her coffee and looked out at the grassland. The trouble with the Denton brothers came in the 4th week of her time at the ranch. It was a Tuesday, which she would remember clearly because she had been making preserves from the wild plums she had found growing along the creek, and the kitchen smelled extraordinary, and she had been feeling, for the first time since arriving in Caldwell, something close to settled. They rode in, 3 of them mid-morning. They were from a neighboring spread to the south that had a long and contentious relationship with the Haskins ranch over water rights to the creek that ran along the property line. The Denton brothers, she had learned from Mrs. Aldred on a supply trip to town, were the kind of men who had been told for most of their lives that they were owed something, and who had decided to believe it. Peter was out on the North Range, and Lou was with him. It was just Susanna and Ben in the house when the 3 men rode into the yard, and the eldest, a heavy-set man named Cal Denton, knocked on the kitchen door with the particular knock of someone who does not actually plan to wait for an answer. She opened the door and looked at him without stepping back, because she had enough experience of difficult men to know that stepping back was often the thing that encouraged them. "We're looking for Haskins," Cal Denton said. He was looking past her into the kitchen. "He's not here," she said. "He'll be back by midday." "Who are you?" "The housekeeper," she said. Cal Denton's gaze moved over her in the assessing, proprietary way of men who have never learned that looking at a woman like that is not a right. "Well, housekeeper," he said, "you tell your boss that the fence on the south line has come down again, and if it isn't fixed by end of week we'll be fixing it ourselves, and we charge for our time." "I'll tell him," she said. He nodded and turned to go, and then one of the younger brothers said something low to the third one, and they both laughed, the kind of laugh that is aimed at someone and intended to make that someone feel small. Susanna waited until they had ridden out of the yard before she closed the kitchen door and stood for a moment with her hand on the latch and her jaw set tight. Ben was watching her from the table. "Those men aren't nice," he said in his careful, serious way. "No," she agreed. "They are not." "Papa says Cal Denton would steal the shoes off a sleeping man," Ben said. "Your papa sounds about right," she said. When Peter came in at noon and she told him about the visit, his face did the thing it did when something had made him angry, which was to go still and flat in a way that was somehow more alarming than if he had raised his voice. He stood in the kitchen holding his hat and listening to her account without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He didn't give you any trouble?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him turning something over behind his eyes. "I'll ride down to the south line this afternoon," he said. "That fence has been a point of dispute for 2 years. I'd rather settle it than keep trading visits." "That seems sensible," she said. He was still looking at her, and she returned the look steadily, and then he said, "Thank you for dealing with it." It was, she thought, the longest sentence he had directed at her that was not about food or ranch logistics, and she felt it land somewhere in the region of her chest with a warmth she was not entirely sure what to do with. The fence situation resolved itself over the following week through a combination of Peter's directness, Lou's legal knowledge of the water rights agreement, and a calm letter from Susanna herself, who had a clear and precise way of writing that had surprised Peter considerably when he found the draft she had done at his request, a letter to the county land office clarifying the boundary. He had read it twice and then looked at her with an expression that contained several things he did not say, and she had simply gone back to the stove. She had written letters for people her whole life, for neighbors who could not write well themselves, for the restaurant owner in St. Joseph, for her mother when the words needed to be official, It was not something she thought of as remarkable, but the way Peter Haskins held that letter and read it made her understand that it was, to him, remarkable. "Where did you learn to write like this?" he asked. "My father was a schoolteacher," she said. "Before the war. We didn't have much, but we had books." He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. "My father couldn't read," he said. "I learned from the minister's wife when I was 12. It was, she realized, the first thing he had told her about himself that was not directly related to the operation of the ranch. She kept her voice neutral because she understood instinctively that if she made anything of it, he would close back up. "Did she teach you well?" she asked. "Well enough," he said. And then, after a pause, "Clara used to read to Ben every night, poetry mostly. She liked poetry." Susanna was quiet. "He doesn't sleep well now," Peter said, and his voice was matter-of-fact, but there was something under the matter-of-fact that was not matter-of-fact at all. "He wakes up in the night sometimes. I don't know what to do about it." She thought for a moment. "There are books in the sitting room," she said. "I noticed them the other day when I was dusting. Some of them look like poetry collections." He was very still. "I could read to him in the evenings," she said. "If you think he might like that. If you think it would be all right." He stood at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and looked at the folded letter and did not say anything for long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then he said, "That might be all right," and picked up the letter and went out onto the porch. That night, and every night after that for the next 2 months, Susanna sat in the chair beside Ben's bed and read to him from Clara Haskins' poetry books, and the boy fell asleep more peacefully than he had in 2 years. And sometimes when she came out into the hall after, she found that Peter had been standing in the doorway listening, his shoulder against the frame, his arms crossed, his face carrying that expression that was becoming familiar to her. The one that was full of things he had not yet found words for. There was a harvest dance in Caldwell in October, which was a social event that the town took seriously in the way that small communities take the few occasions for collective joy seriously, decorating and organizing and arguing about details for 2 weeks in advance. Mrs. Aldred, who served on the planning committee, mentioned it to Susanna on a Thursday when Susanna had come to town for supplies. "You should come," Mrs. Aldred said. "There'll be a fiddle player from Wichita who's supposed to be very good, and the Drummond girls are making pie." "I don't know if I'll be free," Susanna said. "Invite Peter Haskins," Mrs. Aldred said, in the tone of a woman who is not actually making a suggestion so much as she is issuing an instruction. "He hasn't been to a town event since Clara's funeral. That's not good for a man." Susanna loaded her supplies into the back of the wagon. "I don't know that he'd want to go." "Ask him," Mrs. Aldred said. "Worst he can do is say no. And I suspect, based on what I've been hearing from Lou Garrett, that he's getting a little better at saying other things lately." Susanna looked at her. Mrs. Aldred smiled, and it was a smile that contained a great deal of informed affection. "Lou says the man complimented the apple pie last week, voluntarily." He had, in fact, complimented the apple pie in a way that had made Susanna have to concentrate very hard on the pie plate she was washing at the time. She had used Clara's own recipe, which she had found written in a careful hand on a card tucked into the back of the kitchen Bible, and when she set it on the table, Peter had looked at it for a long moment before he cut himself a piece, and then he had said, "This is good. This is really good." And his voice had been quiet and almost wondering, and she had thought she might need to step out into the yard for a moment to breathe. She asked him about the dance the next morning, because she had decided that the morning was the time when he was most approachable, when the coffee and the quiet and the early light had done their work, and he was capable of something close to ease. She said simply that there was a harvest dance in Caldwell on Saturday, and that she had been invited and wondered whether he would mind if she attended. And then, because she was Susanna Carter and not a woman who did things by halves, she said, "I wondered if you might want to come." He looked at his coffee. "I don't go to town dances," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't go to town at all much from what Lou tells me." But Ben's been sleeping better and I could arrange for Mrs. Aldridge's girl to sit with him, and it would only be the one evening. He was quiet. You don't have to dance, she said. You could just come and stand at the edge and drink the cider and feel superior to everyone who's dancing badly, which I understand is an option some people find quite satisfying. He looked up at her, and for the first time in the month and a half she had known him, she saw something that was almost a smile pull at the corner of his mouth. Just one corner, just briefly, like sunlight through a narrow gap in a cloud bank. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right. The dance," he said. "I'll take you." She turned back to the stove because she did not entirely trust the expression currently on her face. Saturday came with the cool, bright clarity of a Kansas October, the sky high and blue, the cottonwood trees along the creek gone gold and rattling softly in the wind. Susanna wore her better dress, the dark blue wool one that she had been saving, and she did her hair properly with the combs her mother had left her. And when she came out of her room into the kitchen, Peter Haskins was at the table in a clean shirt and a dark coat that he looked like he had retrieved from the back of a wardrobe and brushed carefully, and he stood up when she came in. He stood up. He had not done that before, and she was not entirely sure he knew he had done it. He just looked at her and stood up, the way a man does sometimes when something happens that makes him forget to stay seated. "You look nice," he said. His voice was level and careful, the way his voice always was, but there was something underneath the level that was not level at all. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." He put his hat on and held the door. Ben watched them go from the porch with Mrs. Aldridge's granddaughter beside him, and he lifted his hand and waved. And Peter stopped and walked back up the porch steps and crouched down to Ben's height and said something to him quietly. And Ben nodded, and Peter ruffled his hair very briefly, and then came back to the wagon. It was an entirely ordinary moment, and Susanna had to look away from it because ordinary moments can sometimes be the ones that undo you most completely. The dance hall in Caldwell was a substantial wooden building that had been decorated with corn husks and dried flowers and lanterns that threw orange light across the faces of 60-odd people in various states of enjoyment. The fiddle player from Wichita was, as advertised, very good, and the Drummond girls' pie was excellent, and Mrs. Aldridge moved through the crowd with the authority of a general and the warmth of a grandmother, which was essentially what she was. Peter Haskins stood at the edge of the room and drank cider and watched the dancing. Susanna had not been wrong about his capacity for finding that particular satisfaction, but she noticed that he was also watching the room with something more than detachment, something more like a man reminding himself what the world looks like when it is not grieving. She danced with Lou Garrett, who was a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man who moved like a piece of weathered fence post in everyday life, and with Tommy, the wagon driver, who was not graceful at all but made up for it in enthusiasm. She danced with the blacksmith's oldest son and with the minister, who danced with the serious concentration of a man attempting a mathematical proof. And each time she came back to where Peter was standing, she found that he had moved incrementally closer to the dancing, the way a shy animal moves towards something that interests it, so gradually you could almost pretend it was not moving at all. "Do you know how?" she asked the fourth time she came back to him. "How to what?" "Dance." He looked at the floor. "Clara tried to teach me," he said. "I was not a natural student." "Will you try?" she said, and she said it the way she had learned to say things to him, straight and simple and without pressure, the way you offer something to someone without making the refusal into a catastrophe. He looked at her. In the orange lantern light his eyes were darker than usual, and the lines of his face were softer, and he was, she realized with a quality of attention that surprised her, a genuinely handsome man who had been too busy being alone to let anyone notice it. "I'll try," he said. He was not good at it. He was, as he had indicated, not a natural student, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who is thinking too hard about where his feet are supposed to be. But he kept trying, and when she laughed at a particularly spectacular misstep, he laughed too, or something very close to laughing. A short, low sound that she felt rather than heard because she was that near to him. And she thought that this might be the first time he had laughed since his wife died, and she kept her expression steady because she did not want to make anything of it and scare it away. They drove home under a sky so full of stars it looked like something that had been planned by someone who loved excess. The great blazing arm of the Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon. The horse knew the road and they let it find its own pace. And Susanna sat beside Peter on the wagon seat with the night air cold and clear around them, and the sound of the horse's hooves steady on the road. And they talked, actually talked, for the first time in the way that people talk when they have stopped performing ease and have arrived at the actual thing. He told her about growing up in Missouri, in a county near where she had grown up, which neither of them had known, and about how he had come west at 18 with $40 and a mule, and the intention of making something that was his own. She told him about her family, her father the schoolteacher and her mother who could make anything grow, and her two brothers who had both gone east after the war and never come back. She told him about St. Joseph and the restaurant and the long series of small decisions that had ended with her stepping off a stage in Caldwell with $17 and a letter. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Of what?" "Of coming here, to a stranger's ranch." On that letter, she thought about it honestly because he was asking honestly. "I was more afraid of staying where I was," she said. He was quiet with that for a moment. "I understand that," he said. They rode on through the dark and the stars, and when the ranch came into view, and the lights in the house told them that Ben was safely in bed with the granddaughter of Mrs. Aldred watching over him, Susanna felt a warmth in her chest that was about the lights in the windows as much as it was about anything else. The particular warmth of seeing a house and feeling, with some portion of yourself that operates below conscious reasoning, that it might be yours. November arrived and brought with it the first hard frosts and the shifting of the ranch's work toward the preparations for winter. Peter and Lou brought the cattle to the closer pastures and checked the hay stores and repaired the barn roof, and Susanna put up the last of the preserves and pulled the kitchen garden and planted the garlic for spring because she had decided, without formally deciding anything, that she would be here in spring to see it come up. She and Peter had settled into a kind of domestic partnership that had its own language, the language of people who share a space and the care of a child, and have arrived at a mutual understanding that does not yet have a name. He told her things, not always personal things but things that mattered to him, about the ranch and the cattle and the weather and the state of the range. She told him things in return. They disagreed, occasionally, with the productive friction of two people who respect each other's intelligence and are not afraid to be wrong. He said please now, consistently, naturally, the way a person says something that has become part of their vocabulary again after a long absence. She noticed it every time, not with the particular weight of that first morning, but with a gentle, accumulating warmth, the way you notice the light growing in the weeks before spring. Ben was different too. He spoke more, laughed more, brought her things he found interesting in the way children do when they trust someone, a feather, a strangely shaped stone, a piece of bark that looked, he insisted, exactly like a horse's head. He had started asking Peter questions at the dinner table, and Peter answered them with a patience and deliberateness that she thought he was learning in real time, building the skill of fatherly presence the way he had built the ranch, one careful piece at a time. There was an evening in the middle of November when she was sitting at the kitchen table with Clara's recipe book, copying down some of the recipes into a notebook of her own, and Peter came in from the cold and stood by the stove warming his hands and saw what she was doing and went still. "That's Clara's book," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've been cooking from it. I should have asked permission. I'm sorry." He was quiet for a long moment. "She would have wanted it used," he said finally. She loved to feed people. It was her great talent, feeding people. "The recipes are very good," Susanna said. She meant it. He looked at the book and then at her, and she held his gaze steadily because she thought he needed that, someone who would look at him steadily when he was in the vicinity of grief. "She would have liked you," he said. His voice was low. "She would have liked your directness. She used to say that most people made her guess what they were thinking, and it exhausted her." Susanna felt the weight of that, the complicated honor of it. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," she said. "She was," he said, simply and without performance, "the way you say something that is just and completely true." They were quiet after that, in the kitchen with the fire going and the wind outside and Ben asleep, and the quiet was not empty. It was full of something that neither of them had named yet, but both of them, she thought, had begun to understand. The week before Christmas, a letter arrived for Susanna. It came with the post rider who passed through twice a month, and it was from her cousin in Caldwell, who had moved back east in October after her husband took a job in Cincinnati. The cousin wrote cheerfully and at length, but the substance of it was clear. The connection that had brought Susanna to Kansas was severed, and the cousin thought perhaps Susanna ought to consider what she wanted to do next, whether she wanted to come east or perhaps return to Missouri. Susanna read the letter 3 times and then folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went on making the bread, because there was bread to be made, and she was not the kind of person who stopped making bread just because her circumstances had become complicated. She thought about what she wanted to do next. She thought about it with her hands in the dough, and later, while she hung laundry in the cold, bright air, and later still, while she read to Ben from the poetry book and watched his face go soft and drowsy. She thought about $17 and a carpetbag and stepping off a stage. She thought about a kitchen that had needed someone to care for it. She thought about a man who had said please as though the word surprised him. She did not tell Peter about the letter immediately. She was not sure what she would say when she did tell him. She was not sure what she wanted from the telling. It was Lou who told her, unexpectedly, on a cold afternoon when she had brought coffee out to the yard where he was mending a section of fence. He said it sideways, in the way Lou said important things, coming at the center of them from the outer edge. "You know," he said, wrapping wire around the fence post with practiced hands, "I've worked for Peter Haskins for 12 years. I was here when he built this place from nothing. I was here when he married Clara and here when she died." He paused. "I've seen that man in just about every condition a man can be in." "I know you have," Susanna said. "He's different since you came," Lou said. He said it plainly, no decoration, no implication. "And I don't mean the food, though the food is considerably better, and I say that with all respect to the previous situation." He tightened the wire. "I mean him, he's different." Susanna held the coffee mug with both hands for the warmth of it. "He looked at you in town the night of the dance," Lou said. "The way he used to look at Clara, I noticed. I wasn't trying to notice, but I did." She was quiet. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do," Lou said. "I'm just an old man fixing a fence. I just thought someone should say it." She went back to the kitchen and the bread and the ordinary afternoon, and that evening after Ben was in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her, and Peter came in and saw it, and she did not hide it. "Letter from your cousin?" he asked. He had known the letter had arrived. "Yes," she said. "She's moved to Cincinnati. She's doing well." He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, which was something he had not done before, sat across from her at the kitchen table in the evening with nothing particular to discuss. He looked at the letter. "Does she want you to come?" he asked. "She suggests it," Susanna said. "Or going back to Missouri. She's concerned about me being out here with no family nearby." He was quiet. She watched his hands around his coffee mug, large hands, work-scarred, the hands of a man who had built things. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "To go?" She met his eyes. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I haven't decided." He nodded slowly. He looked at the table between them, at the letter and the lamp and the space that was neither close nor far. And then he looked up at her and said something that she had not expected, because she had learned to read him fairly well, but he was still, occasionally, capable of surprising her. "I don't want you to go," he said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him something, she could see that. I should tell you that clearly instead of waiting for you to figure it out because I know that's been my way, but I don't think it's the right way. I don't want you to go, Susanna, and that is not about the cooking. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere. No, she said. I didn't think it was. I haven't said things that I should have said, he said. I'm not good at it. I know I'm not good at it. Clara used to say that I express things better by doing them than by saying them, and she was right. And I've been doing things, I think, that meant something, but I haven't said the things, and you deserve to have them said. She leaned forward slightly, just slightly, across the table. I think about you, he said, considerably more than is convenient. I think about you when I'm out on the range, and I think about you in the evening, and I think about you when Ben laughs in the kitchen in a way I haven't heard him laugh in 2 years. He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to speeches, and the effort of this one was visible in him, in the set of his jaw and the careful pace of his words. I know you've been here 4 months, and I know that's not long, and I know there are things about me that are difficult, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I am asking you plainly if you would consider staying, not as the housekeeper, as something different, as something more. The kitchen was very quiet. I would consider it, she said. And then, because she was Susanna Carter and not a woman who said less than she meant, I have been considering it for some time. He looked at her, and the closed look was gone, entirely gone, and what was underneath it was something that was both more complicated and more simple than anything she had expected. A man who was still very much in the process of learning how to be open, but who had decided to try anyway and was asking her to stay while he was still learning. Would you like to take a walk? He said. It's cold, but there are stars. There were stars. There were an outrageous number of stars, the Kansas winter sky being the kind that made you feel simultaneously very small and very significant. And they walked along the path toward the cottonwood trees in the dark with their breath clouding in the cold air and the frozen grass crunching under their boots. He reached for her hand. He did it carefully and deliberately, the way he did everything, and she let him take it, and they walked in the dark and the cold and the extraordinary starlight, and the world was very large and very quiet all around them, and Susanna Carter thought, with a completeness and clarity that she had never quite felt before, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He kissed her at the turn of the path near the cottonwood trees, which was, she thought, the right place for it, near the trees that had been there longer than the ranch and would likely be there after them both. He was not tentative about it, and he was not rough about it. He was careful in the way he was careful about everything, and then he was not careful at all, and she was glad of both things. They told Ben the next morning. He was eating his breakfast with the focused attention he brought to every task, and Susanna sat across from him and Peter sat at the head of the table, and they told him simply that they had become very fond of each other and that Susanna was not going to be leaving. Ben put down his fork and looked at Susanna and then at his father and then back at Susanna. Fond how? He said. Peter glanced at Susanna. Fond enough to get married, Peter said, if she'll have me. Ben looked at Susanna with an expression of absolute seriousness. Will you? He said. I think I will, Susanna said. Ben picked up his fork and continued eating. Good, he said, with the decisive satisfaction of a child who has resolved a question that has been bothering him for some time. They were married in February of 1879, in Caldwell, in the church that was too cold for comfort but warm enough for purpose, with Mrs. Aldred in the front pew looking deeply satisfied with events, and Lou Garrett standing up with Peter in his best coat and his handlebar mustache freshly trimmed for the occasion. Ben sat in the front pew beside Mrs. Aldred and watched his father get married with the grave attention of a small boy performing his duties as a witness, which was, essentially, what he understood his role to be. Susanna wore the blue wool dress and her mother's combs, and Peter wore a new dark coat that he had ordered from the general store and which fit him extremely well. And when he looked at her coming down the aisle of the cold little church, he had the expression that she had come to know well, the one that was full of things he did not say, except that today it also had in it something that was not quite possible to contain, something that was joy, plain and sufficient and real. He said his vows in his careful, deliberate voice, looking straight at her the entire time, and she said hers looking straight at him. And when the minister pronounced them, married Peter Haskins kissed his wife in front of the assembled citizens of Caldwell, Kansas, which was not entirely the custom, but which was. Everyone agreed afterward over pie and cider at the church hall. Exactly right. Lou Garrett shook Peter's hand and clapped him on the shoulder with an emotion he disguised as practicality. "You've done well," he said, "for a man who didn't know what he was doing." "I generally don't," Peter said, looking at Susanna across the room where she was talking to Mrs. Aldred with the ease of a woman who has made friends and intends to keep them. "I just keep going until something works." "That's called being alive," Lou said. "You're getting better at it." The spring that followed was the spring Susanna had planted for, the garlic coming up in green spears through the March mud, the kitchen garden taking shape under her hands in a way that gave the house a different quality of life, a sense of intention and continuity. She planned what she would grow and what she would preserve and what she would put in for the summer table, and Peter watched her work in the garden with the same quality of attention she had first seen him direct at the horizon, thorough and unhurried and genuinely interested. He helped her. This was something she had not expected. A man like Peter Haskins getting down in the dirt of a kitchen garden to turn soil. But he appeared one Saturday morning with a spade and asked her where she wanted the beds extended. And she showed him, and he worked beside her all morning, and they talked while they worked, about the ranch and the future and things they had not gotten around to saying yet. And Ben ran back and forth between the garden and the barn in the uncomplicated joy of a child who has been returned to himself. Summer arrived in its full Kansas excess, hot and golden and enormous, and the ranch prospered the way ranches prosper when they are run well, and the rain is sufficient, and the cattle prices are favorable, which they were that year. Peter rode the range and managed the herd and handled the business of the ranch, and Susanna managed the house and the garden and did the accounts, because it had turned out, to Peter's considerable relief, that she was as good with figures as she was with words, and the ranch accounts had been kept in a state that Lou characterized diplomatically as informal. She organized them into a system that was clear and accurate, and that Peter could read and understand in minutes rather than hours, and he sat at the kitchen table going through the new ledger one evening with an expression of pure unguarded appreciation and said, "You are extraordinary," and she said, "I am practical," and he said, "Those aren't mutually exclusive," and kissed her above the ear in a way that made her lose her place in the accounts she was also reviewing. They found out she was expecting their child in late July, which was a Sunday, and therefore a rare day of general slowness on the ranch. She told him in the kitchen in the morning directly, as was her way, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, which was to break entirely open, every careful structure of restraint gone in a single moment, and he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her with a thoroughness and fierceness that left her in no doubt whatsoever of his feelings. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "How long have you known? Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "A few weeks." "And I am very well." He held her for another moment and then pulled back and looked at her face with an intensity that was almost comical, except that it was also entirely serious. "What do you need?" He said, "Tell me what you need." "I need you to stop looking at me like I'm made of glass," she said, "because I am not made of glass. I am made of considerably sturdier material, and I need the water pump in the yard fixed because it's been dripping for a week and I've been meaning to mention it." He laughed. Actually laughed, not the brief, startled sound of the dance hall, but a full laugh, out loud in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, a laugh that seemed to surprise him by its own existence, and then didn't seem to surprise him at all. And she thought that this was perhaps the most complete thing she had ever seen him do, the laughing and the surprise of the laughing, and the acceptance of the surprise. Ben, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway in the middle of all of this, looked between his father and his stepmother with a careful expression. "Why is Papa laughing?" he said. "Because," Peter said, pulling Susanna back against him with one arm, "you're going to have a brother or a sister." Ben's eyes went wide. He looked at Susanna with a searching intensity. "Which one?" he said. "We won't know for a while," she said. He absorbed this information. "I'd like a brother," he said. "I already know girls from school and they're complicated." "They are complicated," Peter agreed, and Susanna elbowed him firmly and he smiled above her head. The pregnancy proceeded well, because Susanna was healthy and sensible, and because Peter, despite her instructions not to treat her as though she were made of glass, was attentive in ways that were mostly useful and only occasionally excessive. He brought her things without being asked, fixed everything in the house that had needed fixing, painted the front porch railing, and put a cushion on the kitchen chair that she had once mentioned was hard, which she had said in passing 3 weeks earlier and had completely forgotten she said. Lou Garrett, upon hearing the news, went to town and came back with a small carved wooden horse that he presented to Susanna without ceremony. "For when the time comes," he said. "If it's a boy, he'll want a horse. If it's a girl, she can have a horse too. Girls can ride." "Girls most certainly can ride," Susanna said. Mrs. Aldred, who came out to the ranch for the first time in years to visit, brought preserves and a wool blanket she had made herself, and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours telling Susanna everything she knew about childbearing in Kansas, which was considerable. Peter, who was in and out of the kitchen during this visit, received each piece of information with the serious attention of a man studying something important. Mrs. Aldred noticed this and approved of it openly. "That man loves you considerably," she told Susanna at the end of the visit while Peter was bringing her horse around. "I don't know if he says it enough." "He says it in his way," Susanna said. "I've learned his way. It suits me." Mrs. Aldred patted her hand. "Good girl," she said. "Not all love has to be said in the same words. Most of the best of it doesn't." The child was born on a cold, clear morning in late March of 1880, a boy, as Ben had requested, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and a voice that he used immediately, and at volume to announce his arrival into the world. Peter Haskins, who had delivered calves in worse conditions but had never in his life been this thoroughly undone by anything, sat on the edge of the bed after the doctor left and held his son with the careful, wondering expression of a man encountering something he does not have adequate words for. "Hello," he said to the baby, who blinked at him with the unfocused concentration of the very new. "Hello there." Susanna, propped against the pillows and tired in the deep, fulfilled way of a woman who has done an enormous thing and knows it, watched her husband meet his son, and felt something settle in her chest that had been in the process of settling since the first morning in the kitchen, since the biscuits and the pleas and the slow, deliberate unfolding of a man who had been closed for too long. They named him James, for Susanna's father. Ben was brought in to meet his brother with the gravity of a young man of 8 who takes his responsibilities seriously. He looked at James for a long time with his arms folded, the serious, considering expression that was entirely his own, and then he said, "He's very small." "He'll grow," Peter said. "He doesn't do much," Ben said. "You didn't do much either," Peter said, "for quite a while." Ben considered this. He reached out and put one finger very carefully against the baby's hand, and James, in the way of new babies, wrapped his fingers around Ben's finger with astonishing grip, and Ben's face changed in a way that had nothing to do with deliberation, going entirely soft and young and full of something that was entirely and simply love. He looked up at Peter and then at Susanna. "Can have the wooden horse Lou gave him," Ben said, "when he's old enough." "That's generous of you," Susanna said. "I have the real one," Ben said practically, which was true, since Peter had recently begun teaching him to ride properly. "He'll need somewhere to start." The summer of 1880 was the best summer the Haskins ranch had known in years, which was partly the weather and partly the cattle market and partly, Susanna thought, simply the quality of living in a place where things were going right. James thrived in the summer heat with the implacable contentment of a well-fed, well-loved baby, sleeping in the cradle that Peter had built himself in the evenings, slowly and with great care, in the weeks before the birth. It was not a fancy cradle, but it was perfectly made, each joint tight, each surface smooth. And she had looked at it when he brought it into the bedroom and understood clearly what it cost a man like Peter to sit in the lamplight night after night working with his hands on something so deliberate and tender. She told him what she thought of the cradle, which was everything she thought, directly and fully, because she had learned that with Peter the direct and full telling was what reached him best, that he needed words that arrived at the center of a thing and did not circle around it. He stood in the bedroom looking at the cradle she was looking at, and then he looked at her, and she went to him because she wanted to, and he held her with the easy certainty of a man who has learned that holding someone he loves is not a weakness, but the most precise and meaningful thing he can do. "I used to think," he said very quietly into her hair, "that if I let myself have things again, something would take them away." "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "You were not entirely wrong," she said carefully. "Things can be lost. Clara was real and her loss was real, and you can carry that, but you can also carry this. People can hold more than one thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara would have liked this," he said, "all of this. She always wanted the house full." "It's getting there," Susanna said. He made a sound that was agreement and something more than agreement, something that was gratitude and grief and joy, all pressed together into the wordless space that was his particular country. And she held him in it and did not try to translate it, because some things do not need translation. Ben, who was now 9 and growing at a rate that kept Susanna constantly adjusting his shirts, had become a serious and rather wonderful person who read everything he could get his hands on and had opinions about cattle, and whether that Lou Garrett took with genuine respect and a faint air of parental pride, since Lou had essentially been a second father to the boy through the hard years, and felt entitled to some reflected satisfaction in his development. Ben had also, in the fall of 1880, decided to teach James to talk, beginning this project when James was approximately 7 months old and therefore not yet capable of producing intentional sounds, a fact that did not deter Ben in the slightest. He sat beside the cradle in his spare time and told James words very deliberately and waited for a response that did not come and tried again tomorrow, with the patient methodology of a young person who understood from his own experience that language returns on its own schedule. James said his first clear word at 11 months. It was, to no one's great surprise, Ben. Ben received this development with the composed satisfaction of a person whose hypothesis has been confirmed. Peter looked across the kitchen at Susanna with an expression that was only available to parents, the expression of watching your children be entirely and specifically themselves, and she returned the look with the fullness of what she felt, which was considerable. The autumn of 1880 brought the end of the Denton brothers' trouble in a way that Susanna had not expected, but that she thought said something clear and useful about how things change when they are given time and good management. Cal Denton had sold his spread to a family from Ohio who were, from their first meeting with Peter at the county land office, entirely reasonable people interested in good relations with their neighbors. The water rights dispute that had poisoned the property line for years was resolved in a single afternoon of sensible conversation and the drawing of a clear map that both parties signed. Peter came home from that meeting in a better mood than Susanna had ever seen him return from town, and he came through the kitchen door and lifted her off the ground in a manner that startled James considerably and made Ben look up from his book with an expression of tolerant approval. "The Denton business is finished," he said. "I gathered," she said, from approximately 3 inches off the ground. "The new family is named Carpenter. They have 3 children and a wife who wants to exchange recipes." "Put me down," she said, and he did, and she smoothed her apron. Tell the carpenter wife to come for coffee next week. I already told her, he said. He looked slightly pleased with himself. Did you? She said. I'm learning to anticipate things, he said. She pressed her hands flat against his chest in the way she did sometimes, not pushing, just placing, feeling the solid fact of him. You are, she said. You really are. The Carpenter family became good neighbors and eventually friends in the way that frontier friendships work, slowly and practically, and on the basis of shared circumstance. The Carpenter wife, whose name was Helen, was a forthright woman from Cincinnati, who had followed her husband west with a mixture of enthusiasm and significant reservations, and who found in Susanna a companion who had made similar choices by similar logic, and was willing to talk about them honestly over coffee on Thursday afternoons. These Thursday afternoons became a fixed point in Susanna's week that she valued in a way she had not fully expected. She had not had close women friends since Missouri, since before St. Joseph, and the particular pleasure of being known by another woman, the ease of talking to someone who understood things from the same side, was something she had not realized she had been missing until she stopped missing it. She told Peter about it one evening, told him that she was glad for Helen's friendship, and he listened with the full attention he gave to things that mattered to her, which was the same full attention he gave to the condition of the cattle and the state of the range, which was to say absolute. He said he was glad she had someone to talk to, and that he had known she must miss having women in her life here, and she looked at him with the particular quality of attention that she reserved for moments when he said something that demonstrated exactly how thoroughly he had been paying attention to her. You noticed that, she said. I notice most things about you, he said. I have from the beginning. I wasn't ready to say much about it for a while. I know, she said. I noticed that about you too. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was something he did still with the deliberateness that characterized everything he did, but without any of the earlier hesitation, the ease of a man who has arrived at the thing he was building toward and found it to be what he hoped. Winter came again, the second winter of their marriage, and the house was different from the first winter she had spent in it. It was different in the way that houses become different when they are inhabited by people who intend to stay, the small accumulations of a life being lived. Ben's books stacked by his favorite chair, James's wooden toys collecting in corners, the smell of the garden preserved in the rows of jars in the larder, the new curtains Susanna had made from fabric Mrs. Aldred had brought out from town, the rag rug by the kitchen stove that she and Helen Carpenter had made on 3 consecutive Thursdays in November. Peter had hung a picture of the 3 of them, Ben and Susanna and himself, taken by the photographer in Caldwell on the occasion of their first anniversary, on the wall by the kitchen door. It was a formal picture in the manner of the time, stiff and carefully composed, but Susanna knew that she and Peter were both fighting an expression that was not quite proper for a formal photograph, and Ben had failed to fight his entirely and was visibly on the verge of smiling. She loved that picture unreasonably. There was also, beside it, the small oval photograph of Clara that had always been on the mantelpiece in the sitting room. Susanna had moved it to the kitchen wall herself, because she thought it belonged near where the life of the family happened, and because Ben should be able to see his mother's face in the ordinary course of a day without it being a special occasion. Peter had found her doing it and stood very still in the kitchen doorway watching her hang it, and then he had helped her straighten it on the wall, and they had stood looking at it together, this woman who had come before, who had built the thing that they were now living in and tending and growing. She looks kind, Susanna said. She was, Peter said. Ben has her ears, Susanna said. He looked at the photograph and then at her. He has your stubbornness, he said. He was stubborn before I got here, she said. Yes, Peter said, but now he comes by it from 2 directions. She laughed and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the kitchen with Clara's photograph, and their own on the wall and James asleep in the other room, and the fire going in the stove. And Susanna thought about arriving in a place with $17 and a battered carpetbag and no certainty about anything. and about how the things you build when you have no certainty are sometimes the most solid things of all, because they have been tested at every stage of their building. Spring came back in 1881, with the garlic she had planted the previous fall coming up strong and early, small green fingers pushing through the March soil, with the irrepressible confidence of things that have been underground all winter and have decided they have been underground long enough. James, who was now a year old and unsteady on his feet but absolutely determined about the direction of his travel, made his way across the kitchen floor toward the open door and the garden with the focused intention of a person going somewhere important. Peter caught him before he made it out the door and lifted him up, and James laughed with the full-body joy of a child being held in the air by someone large and safe and his. And Peter held him against his chest and stood at the door looking out at the garden and the cottonwood trees and the sky over the grass. Ben came out of the barn and saw his father standing in the doorway with James and walked over and stopped beside them and looked at whatever they were looking at, which was essentially just the world, the ranch and the grass and the sky, all of it theirs, all of it going on. Susanna came to stand beside Peter with her coffee, and he put his free arm around her without looking, automatic and certain, and they stood in the doorway of the kitchen in the March sunlight, the four of them, and Ben said, with the dry observational accuracy that was becoming more characteristic of him by the month, "James is going to try to eat that gardening glove if you don't watch him." Peter looked down. James had gotten hold of a gardening glove from the hook by the door and was, in fact, attempting to eat it. Susanna took the glove away from James. James registered his opinion of this development loudly. Peter bounced him until he stopped. Ben went back to the barn. The ordinary morning continued. In the summer of 1881, Susanna discovered she was expecting again, and told Peter in the kitchen in the morning as was her established custom, and he crossed the room in 2 steps as was his established response, and held her with the thoroughness and fierceness of a man who has not run out of feelings about this particular kind of news. "2 children may be sufficient," she said, into his shoulder. "May be," he agreed. "You don't sound convinced." "I'm not opposed," he said, "to the idea of a large family." She pulled back and looked at him. He returned her look with the composed certainty that was entirely his own, the certainty of a man who has arrived, slowly and with considerable difficulty, at his life, and who has no intention of treating it as anything other than the extraordinary and specific thing it is. "A large family," she said. "If you're willing," he said. "Ask me properly," she said, because she always did, always would. He was quiet for a moment, this man who had not said please to anyone for 2 years, who had said it before her first morning was done because something in her had called it back out of him, who had said it every day since because the word had not been gone, only dormant, waiting for the right season. "Please," he said. She smiled, the full smile that she gave him and him alone, the one without performance or economy. "Yes," she said. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1882, with Susanna's dark hair and Peter's gray eyes, and the voice of someone who intended to be heard, which was, the assembled household agreed, an appropriate quality for the daughter of these 2 particular people. They named her Clara Ann, the first name for the woman who had built the foundation of this family and the second for Susanna's mother. And Ben, who was by now 10 and old enough to understand the weight of a name, took the naming of his sister with the gravity it deserved, and was the first person, after her parents, to hold her. James, who was 2 and did not yet fully understand what sisters were, approached the new baby with the investigating interest of a small person encountering an unfamiliar animal and determined within the first day that she was interesting, that she made satisfying sounds when you made faces at her, and that she had an excellent grip, exactly as he himself had at that age, which he could not have known, but which Peter told Susanna later that evening with a softness in his voice that she thought could have felled her if she hadn't been sitting down. Lou Garrett, who had by now become so thoroughly a member of the household that he took his meals in the kitchen as a matter of course, presented Clara Ann with a second carved wooden horse, because he was a man of consistent principles, and she regarded it from her mother's arms with the focused, thoughtful expression of a person who was going to have opinions about things, and was already beginning to organize them. Mrs. Aldred came out for the christening, and sat in the front pew of the Caldwell church, as she had sat for the wedding, with the expression of a woman who has been right about something important, and is satisfied to see the evidence of it laid out so clearly before her. She had told Susanna, on that first day in the general store, that Peter Haskins was not a bad man, only a man who had forgotten how to be around people, and she had been right, and here was the proof of it. 4 of them in the church on a May morning, with the light coming through the plain windows, and the minister reading from the Bible and the baby sleeping through the whole ceremony, with the serene indifference of someone who has accomplished what she came to accomplish and is now resting. The years that followed the christening of Clara Ann Haskins were the years in which everything that had been planted grew, fully and in its season, in the way of things that have been well tended and given time. Ben grew into himself steadily and with purpose, a young man of serious intelligence and quiet humor, and a deep attachment to the land that Peter recognized as the deepest and best thing he could have given his son, because it would outlast everything else. At 14, Ben was helping run the ranch in ways that went beyond the ceremonial, making decisions about the cattle that Peter deferred to with a pride he expressed, typically, by not saying anything and simply following the recommendation. James grew into a boy of considerable energy and good nature, and an absolute inability to sit still for longer than 4 minutes, which Susanna regarded with patience and Peter regarded with the particular expression of a man recognizing himself. James loved horses with the singularity that some children bring to a passion, and he was on a horse by the time he was 4 and competent by the time he was 6, and by 8 was riding with Ben across the range, in a way that made Susanna's heart simultaneously swell and contract. Clara Ann grew into the person her first expression had promised she would be, a person of decided opinions and great warmth, and a remarkable capacity for managing people that everyone recognized, and some found slightly unnerving. She managed Ben with the serene authority of a younger sibling who knows exactly where the power lies, and she managed her father by the simple mechanism of being so completely and obviously herself that he was helpless against it. Peter Haskins, who had once been the most closed and self-contained man in Caldwell County, was completely and contentedly undone by his daughter on a daily basis, and the household regarded this as one of its finest features. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Peter and Susanna sat on the porch of the house in the February cold, wrapped in the wool blanket Mrs. Aldred had brought for James's birth, watching the night come down over the Kansas grassland. The children were inside, Ben reading by the lamp as was his invariable evening practice, James already asleep because he expended everything during the day and had nothing left for night, Clara Ann talking to her wooden horse in the serious private monologue of a 4-year-old conducting important business. Lou Garrett had gone to his bunkhouse after supper, with the discreet tact of a man who knows when people want the porch to themselves. The stars came out, first one and then many and then all of them, the winter sky enormous and brilliant the way it had been on the night they drove home from the harvest dance, 5 years ago, when they had talked in the dark and arrived at the beginning of something neither of them had entirely expected. 5 years, Peter said. 5 years, she agreed. Are you glad? He said. He asked it simply, the way he asked things, looking at the sky, not making it into a crisis, just asking. She considered it with the honest care it deserved. 5 years of the Haskins ranch and the Kansas seasons, and the kitchen that had needed tending, and the man who had needed something harder to name. 5 years of biscuits and preserves and horse-broke children and Lou Garrett's mustache and Mrs. Aldred's opinions and Helen Carpenter's Thursday coffees, and the photograph on the wall and the cradle Peter had built, and the name Clara Ann spoken over a baby in a church. 5 years of a man who said please because she had been there to call it back out of him, and who had gone on saying it in 1,000 daily forms, in the way he held doors and poured coffee and sat across from her at the table in the evenings, in the arm around her shoulders at the kitchen door, in the way he watched her from across a room with an expression that was still, 5 years on, full of things he had not finished saying. "I am profoundly glad," she said. He took her hand under the blanket and held it. "I was not," he said, "in a good way when you arrived. I know," she said, "I was not kind for a time." "You were not unkind," she said. "You were absent. There's a difference. Mrs. Aldred told me that before I ever met you." "Mrs. Aldred," he said, with the tone he always used for her, affectionate and slightly awed. "She's a wise woman," Susanna said. "She is," he said. He was quiet. The cold was clean and the stars were brilliant, and Clara Ann could be heard through the window telling the wooden horse something at length about what was going to happen tomorrow. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand what you gave me, coming here, staying. I understand it." She leaned against him under the blanket. "You gave it back," she said. "You gave it back to yourself. I just stayed long enough to see you do it." "That's the important part," he said. "Someone staying long enough. I was never going to leave," she said. "I knew that before I knew anything else." He was quiet for a moment, holding her hand in the dark. "I knew it too," he said. "I knew it the morning you passed me the biscuits and didn't say anything about the please." She looked up at him. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything about you," he said. "From the beginning, that was my problem." She smiled in the dark. "That wasn't a problem," she said. "That was the beginning of everything." He kissed her temple, the familiar pressure of it, and she settled further against him. And the night went on around them, the cold and the stars and the Kansas grassland vast and full of itself in every direction. And somewhere in the house, Ben turned a page, and Clara Ann concluded her conversation with the wooden horse, and James slept the deep sleep of a child who has used every single thing he had that day, and is ready to do it again tomorrow. And the lamp in the kitchen window was a warm and steady light in the dark. Peter Haskins held his wife's hand on the porch of the house he had built, in the life he had rebuilt, and said nothing more that needed to be said, because some things, the true and essential things, have already been said in all the ways that count. In the biscuits passed across a table, and the word please retrieved from wherever it had been waiting, in the books read to a boy who could not sleep, and the garden planted for a spring you have decided to be there for. In 5 years of mornings, in a kitchen with the fire going and the coffee made, and someone beside you who knows the particular country you live in and has elected, without reservation, to make it theirs. And Susanna Carter, who had arrived with $17 in a carpetbag and no certainty except her own stubborn sufficiency, looked out at the stars over her land and her life, and felt the weight of all of it, the loss and the building and the love that had grown up between them with the slow, irresistible confidence of the garlic in the spring garden. And she was, in every possible way, exactly where she had always been going. The night was full of stars. The house was full of light. And they stayed on the porch a while longer, in the cold and the dark and the enormous Kansas sky, until the cold became persuasive and Peter stood and pulled her up, and they went inside together to the warmth of the house that was theirs, and he latched the door behind them, and the night went on outside without them, which was exactly right, which was what nights are for, to hold the world steady while people rest.